Good evening, Obama leaders. Okay, we are live streaming to the world and they need to know the energy in this room. So let me try this one more time. Good evening, Obama leaders. There we go, a lot better. My name is Veda Sunasi and it's my distinct honor and privilege to be the host of this last session of the 2019 Obama Leaders Africa program. It is hard to believe that we've already been together for 5 days, 5 long and hectic days. But I'm sure you will agree with me, they've also been 5 very memorable days, right? We have had a chance to learn from each other, with each other. We've had a chance to learn from some external guests as well, who have come to share their wisdom and their knowledge. They have taught us how to be better leaders of ourselves, how to be better leaders of others. We have become better storytellers and better advocates. We are walking away with a set of skills, of tools and mindsets, and more importantly, a set of values that we can carry with us as we step on the plane either tonight or tomorrow. As we come to an end, I think it's very important that we bring proper closure to what these last few days have meant to us. And that's exactly what we tried to do today. We started the morning by reflecting on our goals, and we spent the afternoon looking at the values that we hope will guide us as we continue into the future. In that spirit of closure, I can't think of 2 better people to join us this afternoon on this plenary to help us in that journey. I'm sure you will agree with me that the last 5 days have also been a beautiful gift. And like any gift, you need a nice little ribbon to tie it and tie a nice little bow on top of it. And to do that, there are 2 remarkable young people who are going to join me. They are young enough and close enough in age to all of us in this room that they are relatable. We can relate to them, they can relate to us. But they're also experienced and accomplished enough that they have a lot of wisdom that they can share with us, for many of us will be stepping in their shoes in a few years to come. So without any further ado, join me in welcoming our 2 guests. The very first one is somebody who needs no introduction at this stage. He's been spending the last few days with us, hanging out with us. We had a chance to hear from him 2 nights ago. None other than the former deputy advisor to President Obama and speechwriter, Mr. Ben Rhodes. Our second panelist is an accomplished entrepreneur. He hails all the way from Ghana. He is the founder of the African Leadership Group, which constitutes of a number of entities, including the African Leadership Academy, who is our host right now, the African Leadership Network, and the African Leadership University. So please join me in welcoming Ben and Fred. Welcome, Ben and Fred. So I want to start with a disclaimer. This is the last session, and I was told that our objective this afternoon is to bring the roof down, so no pressure, all right? I was also told that my mandate is to have real talk with Ben and Fred, so I am ready for real talk. Are you guys ready for real talk? All right. Absolutely. I want to start with you, Ben. I want to start with actually something that happened in this auditorium last year when President Obama was here. During the town hall, and a gentleman in the audience had asked him, how do we young people get involved in politics when the old guard doesn't seem like they want to move and make way for the youth? And I remember his response at the time was, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said something along the lines of, care less about who you want to be and more about what you want to do. And I heard you
I stole that the other night. Sorry.
You repeated that the other night. But I would love for you to help unpack this a little bit. What does it really mean? Are we really expecting the people in this room to not spend any time thinking about who do they want to become?
Well, I'll just draw from my personal experience. Particularly after I was Deputy National Security Advisor, a lot of young people come to me in the United States and say, which degrees do I have to get, or what 2 or 3 jobs do I have to perform before I can do this? And I would always tell them that if I had had a plan to become Deputy National Security Advisor, White House speechwriter, I never would have become that. I never would have gotten there. My journey was all about finding things that I wanted to do and people I wanted to work for. I was 24 years old and I was getting a master's degree in fiction writing, which is something that the Republicans in my country have had a lot of fun with, and working on a city council campaign in New York City on September 11th, 2001. And I saw the terrorist attacks right before my eyes. I saw the planes fly into the buildings. I saw the first World Trade Center fall. And I kind of knew in that moment that I wanted my life to be about the response, whatever happened because of this. I decided I wanted to be involved in foreign policy. And I started applying for jobs in Washington, D.C. to become a journalist, because I was a writer, to write about foreign policy. And somebody said to me, well, if you want to write and learn about foreign policy, you could also be a speechwriter, which is not something that people usually think of doing. And he referred me to somebody who was hiring a speechwriter, and so I took that job. Again, all I knew is what I wanted to do. I wanted to write, and I wanted to learn more about the world. And I went to work as a speechwriter for somebody. He ended up being the chair of a commission that analyzed what happened on 9/11, the 9/11 Commission in the United States, which was kind of a big deal. But I worked for him for 4 or 5 years, and we prepared lots of good reports on things that were happening. I wrote lots of speeches for him. But I started to realize that, and this gets to the question that was asked last year, if you don't change the people who are in charge, then it doesn't matter how many reports you write, you're not going to have change. And so I wanted to get involved in politics. And I had not thought I was going to get involved in politics. That's what motivated me, is things that I care about won't change unless the leaders change. And the thing that we'd gotten wrong was the Iraq War. And here's Barack Obama, and he represents generational change, and he opposed the war in Iraq. And I said, I want to work for this guy. And I worked for free for a few months. I had another job that allowed me to do that, but I worked my way into that campaign. I told my wife, who was my then girlfriend, I'm going to move out to Chicago, and we're going to go into debt because I want to work for this guy. And she said, well, that's okay. When he loses to Hillary Clinton in a few months, you'll move home. And so I moved out to an apartment that was the size of like a tiny little box to work on the Obama campaign. And I have to tell you, when I walked into that campaign office, and I said this to some of the people in my workshop before, I was 29 years old, and I was like the oldest person in the office. The Obama campaign really was a bunch of 20-somethings and Barack Obama, and that changed the world. Young people believing that they had agency, believing that, no, just because Hillary Clinton is next in line doesn't mean she gets to be the next person in line. Trump stole that message from us 8 years later. But, so to me, what that demonstrates is, because I was curious and followed the things I was interested in and tried to work for people I could learn from and that I admired and respected, I got farther than if I had sat there and tried to calculate some journey to where I was going. And that's also for one important reason. I was better at what I did because I cared about it. We worked 16-hour days on the Obama campaign, and we loved it. If I was working for someone I didn't believe in, I wouldn't have worked 16-hour days, and if I did, I would have been angry about it, And so you have to find a passion, you have to find something you love. And I got some luck along the way too, but I can assure you that if you think about what you want to learn about and what you're curious about and what you want to do, not only will you be more rewarded in a sense because your life will be enriched, you will actually be better at what you're doing.
Fred, care more about what you want to do, less about who you want to be. Are you telling me that you never thought about becoming the successful entrepreneur that you are today?
Well, I can definitely tell you that growing up, being an entrepreneur was actually a dirty word in my family. Because like many African families, I'm sure some folks in the audience can relate, my parents, whenever they showed me role models of people, they would show me doctors and lawyers and engineers. And if someone came to the house and they were involved in business or they're working for themselves, you got the sense that this person's kind of shady. You don't want to be like that. So my ambitions growing up was to be an accountant one day, and then I would change to be an engineer, and then I, just conventional career paths, because those are the role models that I was shown. So definitely did not have a plan to do this. But one of the things that I really believed is that we've been put on earth for a purpose. And things happen in life that guide us towards that purpose. And every now and then, you start to see the patterns of that. So in my case, I grew up in a middle-class family. We're not wealthy by any means. My dad was a civil servant. My mother was a teacher. But that meant that I had 3 meals a day, a roof over my head, and education. And I remember traveling in different parts of Africa. We moved from Ghana to Gambia and Gambia to Botswana. And everywhere I went, I would see, a lot of poverty and people who didn't have education, who would be in the streets. And I wondered, why me? Why did I get the chance to have education and not these people? And I came to at that time, really, I developed a sense that the only way that I could justify my privilege was to use it to serve others. And today I still believe that anyone, and that includes every single person in this room, who is educated, is alive, has gotten professional experiences, our job should not be to simply enrich ourselves and to become famous. We need to actually use those opportunities to serve others and to do things. And we shouldn't be doing small things, we need to be doing big things. And I believe that in Africa, we have too many talkers and not enough doers. And that's really what we need to do.
We spent the last few days talking a lot about leadership and values. And if there's one thing that anybody stepping into the African Leadership Academy notices as you walk into the foyer, the values are on the wall. And I know you personally, and I know that value-based leadership is something that you really care about. The 2 values on the Obama Foundation list of values that I want to spend a few minutes on with both of you. And these are the values of fearlessness and humility. And then we've actually needed to have a conversation about humility at lunch today. One can see how fearlessness and humility might potentially come into conflict. How have you, on your journey as a leader, as an entrepreneur, balanced those 2 things? To be fearless, not ruthless, and still be able to be humble. And what does that mean then to be humble when you are still fearless?
That's a very good question, Veda. I mean, it's something that any leader, I believe, needs to be able to balance the 2. You need to have a certain level of confidence, but you have to be very careful that that confidence doesn't become arrogance or hubris and overconfidence. Because you have to, to imagine, for example, in my case, that we're going to build an institution that's going to develop the next generation of leaders for Africa, for an entire continent, 54 countries. That's pretty audacious and sort of presumptuous to think that you can do something like that. Or now, as we've expanded the work we're doing with the African Leadership Group, we're talking about developing 3 million leaders for Africa. It's a huge, audacious goal. As President Obama had this goal of becoming the President of the United States. So you've got to have some belief in yourself and some confidence and so forth to be able to actually even embark on that journey. But you have to temper that with humility and an understanding that you are not perfect as a leader, because otherwise you're going to have a lot of blind spots and you won't actually be able to achieve your mission. So in my case, there's a couple of very practical things that I do. One is I always make sure I surround myself with people who are much smarter than I am. And in doing so, not only am I getting a great team to work with me on achieving whatever we're trying to achieve, but I'm constantly reminded of my own inadequacies. When I'm surrounded by so many talented people who are better at so many things than I am. Secondly, nothing teaches you humility than failure. And
say more.
Well, as an entrepreneur, I'm constantly failing. And so, if any time I start to think, you got it, you know what you're doing, there's another failure coming around the corner which will just quickly cut you down to size. So, and to the extent that I've been able to achieve any success, it's because I constantly learn from those failures. And, whether it's failures I've made in hiring the wrong person for a role or a wrong business decision I made, there's so many failures that I've made, that I've had, which have forced me to remain humble. But one thing I'll say that I've started noticing recently, and this is going to be a little bit controversial, is I was recently looking at some of the senior leaders that I work with, and I started noticing that the men that I worked with tended to have more confidence in themselves than the competence that they had. And the women that I worked with tended to have less confidence in themselves than the competence that they were. They were a lot more competent than they had confidence. And I started looking, I said, well, is this odd? Am I just, is this some unusual thing I'm seeing in my team? And then I actually went online to look at whether this was a common thing. And there's the first search I put into Google, there was tons of research on this. So it turns out that there's a lot of research that shows that men tend to overestimate their capabilities. And women tend to underestimate their capabilities. So as we think about this, and as we look at developing Africa, there's a gender lens that we need to address if we're going to really move forward as a continent. Whereas men need to constantly check their own hubris, and women need to actually realize that they're capable of a lot more than they are. So for example, one of the data that I saw, they were showing that men tend to apply for roles where they only have 60% of the qualifications. And whereas women will wait until they have 100% of the qualifications, and they still might not apply for the role. So this is really interesting, data that's coming out, and so it's just something to think about.
Mm-hmm. And I will come back to the gender question a bit later on. Ben, I want to switch to you, and this could potentially be a somewhat personal question. I hope you will indulge. Ben, you've received your fair share of accolades. You've been on Time 40 under 40, Forbes 40 under 40. Evidently, you're a remarkable person, great potential, talent. You've done many things. Yet, you've spent 8 years or more, actually, under the shadow of another remarkable leader. Are you just naturally, paragon of humility and servant leadership and followership, or did you ever have to struggle with, having to be behind the scenes? And again, it's in that spirit of understanding, fearlessness, and humility, right?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Part of what you wrestle with when you work for somebody else or you work for a cause is you are channeling all of your energy, all of your thoughts, all of your ideas, all of your ambitions into somebody else, into somebody else's voice in my case, or into somebody else's policies. And you could lose, you lose something of yourself, you lose something, of your own independence of expression. But I also think that you're liberated if you are part of something that is bigger than you. I could never have accomplished a fraction of the things that I got to be a part of if I just set out to do it alone. In my case, it was obviously politics, which is a very high-stakes stage. But because I was able to channel my passion and my ideals into a team, it led to something much bigger. I'll give two examples that get to both fearlessness and humility and ties back to your question. One is, I remember after President Obama was reelected in 2012, we had a meeting where he wanted us to go around the world, literally, and what are the issues that we're not working on that we should? Let's not talk about let's not talk about Russia, and let's not talk about the Middle East. Let's talk about the things that we're not doing that we think we should. And actually, Power Africa came out of that. Yali came out of that. But I said to him, well, Cuba, I'd had conversations with him about, I knew he thought American and Cuban policy was crazy, but there was never a moment, there was nothing that was going to force us to change Cuba policy. So I said, why don't we do something big on Cuba in the second term? And he said, okay, why don't you do it? And I said, what do you mean? And he's like, well, someone's going to have to go talk to the Cubans. Why don't you do that? And I said, well, I'm not really a diplomat. And he says, well, you know what? Most people are going to be afraid to do this because in America it was seen as bad politics to touch this. Don't go there. There are powerful interests that are against this. You'll be attacked if you do this. And I said, okay, I'll do this. And there was a fearlessness that I was able to exhibit because he had confidence in me, right? Because I was a part of this. Then the humility sets in because I closed the door to my office and I thought, I'm not a diplomat. I don't speak Spanish. How am I going to negotiate with the Cubans? And the humility I had to have is first, I had to go find the smartest person I could find, the best Cuba expert in the US government to be my wingman in that process. Because I had to have the humility to know, okay, now I can't do this alone. Just like Obama needed me to do this, I need someone else to help me do this. And I got this extraordinary diplomat who was a great Cuba specialist to be my wingman. And the other piece of humility, and I talked about this a little bit the other night, but then you have to sit down with the Cubans, and America can often be in this big brother paternalistic mood. The humility had to be, no, I have to sit across the table from these people as equals. So the fearlessness of saying we're going to change something. You have to be fearless to think you're going to change something that has always been a certain way. You have to be fearless if you know you're going to be criticized no matter what you do if you make that change. But in order to make that change, I had to have humility. I had to have somebody with me. I had to have expertise I didn't have. I had to recognize what I didn't know and go find somebody else who knew it. And then in order to get something done across that table, I had to have the humility to not fall into the trap that the United States always does, which is to go around the world and tell people what to do, but rather to figure out, well, what can we do together? The last thing that occurred to me as you asked the question, President Obama and I used to have this he liked to have these kind of intellectual debates, in airplanes and car rides. And we'd have these debates about change and how change happens. And does change happen because of social movements that build, or does change happen because great individuals come along and get something done? And we went back and forth and on this. And I remember the very last email I sent from my White House email account that was going to shut down on January 19th, 2017. I sent him an email and I said, I've decided that it's what one man can do because you changed the lives of billions of people. I was trying to say something nice to him before he ended up being his time as president. And then he had a reception for a very small number of staff who'd been there the whole time until the end. And he gave some remarks about what we'd done. And at the very end, he said, Ben and I have been having this debate about how you make change, this discussion. Is it social movements or is it individuals? And I've actually realized it's something else. It's a team. It's something in between. It's the team that can come together to either support the individual or to start the social movement. That we couldn't have done any of the things that we accomplished, even he couldn't have done it as great as he is, without a team of people who are with him. And if you have the right team, that team allows you to be both fearless, and that team also keeps you having some humility.
This is so interesting. Fred, it reminds me of something that you said in your TED Talk when you talk about how in Africa, compared to anywhere else in the world, one individual can have the most significant amount of impact. And we've seen emergence of different kinds of leaders, and we're not going to go into the details of that across the world. Social movement, individuals or teams, who do we need in Africa to effect change? Because there's no question that change is needed on the continent.
Oh, no doubt that you need teams, but we need competent teams. No one person can achieve anything significant alone. You need to surround yourself with people, as I mentioned, who are smarter than you, who are better looking than you, who are more passionate than you, and really ensure that they are really countering your inadequacies as a leader. So I spend about 50% of my time hiring people because I realize that they significantly accelerate my own effectiveness as a leader. And so and it's really, whenever we've accomplished anything great, in my experience, is because we had a great team. It's never because of one person. And so that's how we're going to change Africa.
Did you say better looking than you? Is that why you had hired me
That's
before?
why I hired you,
Okay,
Veda.
thank
Yeah,
you.
that's exactly why I hired you.
Just,
He needs to learn some humility himself.
just confirming. Ben, last night we were having dinner, and I remember you sharing a story. You were telling me how you spent obviously a lot of time with President Obama on Air Force One in motorcades, and you give that example of when you were in Dar es Salaam, I believe, right? Where you had to drive from the airport to the hotel, and the people outside, and you mentioned how very often you felt isolated and in some sort of a bubble, right? But at the same time, a bubble where you are operating at a very high level with very influential people. How do you build humility in such circumstances so you don't become so removed from the people, right, who are standing outside of a motorcade looking in, right, knowing that you are the influencers and the decision makers?
Yeah, it's a great, and the story I was telling is it was both wonderful to be in a place like Dar es Salaam and see tens of thousands of people, but also to feel like you want to stop and talk to those people. You want to know who they are. They've been standing out there waiting, and all they're going to see is this car speeding by. That was a very strange experience to go to places and to see that President Obama could motivate people to want to be a part of him and his story, but not to be able to touch and reach all of them. I think there are a couple of things that are important here. One, if you start to ascend into different positions of power, the mistake that leaders often make, and I was actually just talking to one of the great young leaders here from Sierra Leone about this, is a lot of great leaders, think of some of the leaders on this continent, they started for the right reasons, and they started close to the people. And then the longer they're in power, the farther away they get from those people. And we definitely see that in the United States too. And so what I would always try to do, and I was following the example of President Obama, is if I would go to a country, and because he did this too, I wouldn't just meet with the government officials. I would reach out to our embassy and say, get me a group of people from civil society, or get me a group of people who think that what we are doing is terrible. I want to get yelled at. I want the criticism. I want to make sure that, because I'll tell you something else. If you get in a position of power, well, guess what the people in the other governments tell you? They tell you how wonderful you are and how wonderful this initiative you have is. But if you get out and talk to activists, they're going to tell you something different. And this relates to another point that's interesting, and that relates to why you are all in this room here today, because it had its germ in the Young African Leaders Initiative. So I think it was I forget the exact year, the year that marked the 50th anniversary of most of the liberation movement.
2010.
So 2010, yeah. And so we had a meeting with President Obama, and there's very few of us. It was me and the woman who ran Africa policy for us at the time, and maybe one other person. And what we were going to President Obama with is our concern. Sarkozy is going to have a parade down the Champs-Élysées with all of the heads of state of Africa. Somebody else was going to do something with all the different heads of state of Africa. You are Barack Obama, you are an African who's the President of the United States and first African-American President of the United States. We need to do this too. And he said, why would I want to celebrate this anniversary with a bunch of old people? Some of whom have betrayed the promise of that liberation. I want young people to come here. Let's get young people from every single African country, and I'll have them here. And then they'll see Sarkozy's walking down the Champs-Élysées with a bunch of these old people, and I'll be here with all these young people who are actually the future of Africa. And that was the germ of Yali. That's all it was. It was just a town hall. And so we reached out to all these embassies, and we said, go out and find the best young people and have processes and get these people here. And they came, and then what was so extraordinary is not only was the room amazing and the energy amazing, it was like this room here today, and the remarkable diversity of Africa was on display and the talent, but part of what happened is we started to hear from these Africans, nobody's ever brought us together before. African leaders don't bring us together as Pan-African community. African leaders don't see young people as something to invest in as a Pan-African community. And so it was their idea to do YALI. Please bring us together again. Bring us together in the United States, bring us together on the continent. And we were basically given this idea from the young people that President Obama had invited, right? And this is, back to that point, which is that you can't just get into a bubble with the leaders all talking to each other. That tends to produce less good outcomes. You need to get young people in the room. You need to get activists in the room. You need to get people who are critical of you in the room. And you need to get them together with each other. And frankly, that's what led all the way to this conversation today.
Fred, I believe you were one of the people who were on that group, right?
Yeah, I was one of those 100.
I still want to, Fred, ask you a question about the bubble and the humility to when you might end up in that bubble. I know your context is different. Obviously, you've not been in politics, or maybe you have, we don't know. But we've seen your meteoric rise over the last 15 years, right? From, an unknown consultant to Echoing Green Fellow to, most recently Time 100 Most Influential. Your company, ALU, recognized as the most innovative in Africa, 39th globally. You're hanging out with some really cool people. How do you make sure that you stay humble and don't get caught in that bubble and still are in touch with the young people who you've started working with, 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah. So I think three things that I do. One of my greatest fears is actually that to lose touch with, the work that we're doing. So one of the things that I do practically is try to remain as accessible as possible. So when I don't have a desk or an office at any of my organizations, literally I sit on the same floor with everyone else. So anyone can walk up to me. There's no barrier. There's no door. Anyone can come and talk to me on my team. Right? And so, and I come in and I find, an empty space and I sit down. And so, young leaders at African Leadership Academy, African Leadership University, anyone can come and talk to me, my staff, because what I don't want is a situation where I'm surrounded by people who are only telling me what I want to hear. And this, I think, what happens with many African leaders. And then, there's this constant management of the leader. I want to be told the truth, not only what people think I want to hear. And therefore, it's really, really important to surround myself and make sure that I'm accessible. And an intern on day one of their company, who joins us, can come and tell me what their thoughts or share an idea. Anyone can send me an email and ask for a meeting and so forth. So I really, try to ensure that I remain as accessible as possible. The second thing is, the horizon of the projects that I'm working on. When we started ALA, we said we were going to develop 6,000 leaders in 50 years. Then what we're doing now with the ALU and the broader area group, we said we're going to develop 3 million leaders by 2035. These are very long-term projects. So what that means is that anytime, you get an accolade or something, you're like, well, why are they giving me this thing? I haven't finished my work yet. There's so much more to do. So, yes, you might celebrate a milestone of you've opened 5 sites of the AL family across the continent. But then I look at it and I say, well, okay, that's great, but there's another 295 to build. And that keeps me grounded, and I realize that my work is nowhere near done. Or, yeah, you've raised $200 million. That seems great, but then I've got another 18 billion to raise. So we're just getting started, and you're like, okay, you haven't arrived yet. You've developed 3,000 leaders or 10,000 leaders so far. Okay, there's another, 2.95 whatever to develop, million to develop. So that really keeps you, grounded, and you realize that, okay, you're nowhere near finished. And having that long-term horizon is really another way in which, I stay grounded. And then finally, I try never to read or watch any media about myself. Because the minute you start to believe the media about yourself, then, you lose reality. And so, for example, my TED talk, I think it's been watched by over 1 million people or something, but I've only seen it maybe 3 times. And that was when I was in a meeting with other people and they were watching and I was forced to watch it. I haven't read this thing, The Fast Company. And as much as, okay, these things come out, but I immediately, because, media automatically tends to hype things up. And I really believe in substance over hype, not hype over substance. And so try as much as possible not to read the media that comes out about myself.
Thanks. I want to shift a little bit and I want to talk about ethical leadership, which has been a very big theme of the last few days. And I think it's important we talk about it. And Ben, I don't know if you had time to be able to sit in some of the sessions, especially the ones around ethical dilemmas. And I've been in a few, and I've heard a few interesting things. I've heard things like, there's an African context, and sometimes you need to be aware of that, and you need to compromise a little. I've heard sometimes you got to play the game that you are in, so you can eventually play the game that you want to win. What is ethical leadership? Is it a binary? Is it that either you are or you are not? Is it a spectrum? Is it a gray area? And feel free to leverage example. And you've been in so many decisions where I'm sure it was like borderline, ethical or unethical. And feel free to draw on those if necessary. But please clarify for us, what does it mean to be an ethical leader?
I think to me, what it means is you have to have something at the core of what you're doing. A set of beliefs, a set of values at that core that is something you won't compromise. Think about what you're doing. And I've said this to the workshop earlier, but what happens to a lot of people is they forget why they wanted to be a leader in the first place. Because then they just want the accolades, they want the hype. Usually people, have a motivation that is about something good. They want to change something for the better. Don't ever forget what the thing is that led you to want to be a leader or to make change in the first place. What was that germ that led you into that place? And how do you hold on to that? The reality is, yes, if you're in politics, if you're in business, if you're even in civil society, you're going to find yourself presented with all kinds of dilemmas. And there are going to be times that you're not going to achieve everything you want. And some people live in countries where it's very difficult. It's not that it's an African way, it happens in the United States. We make political compromises that we don't like all the time too. But know the thing that you won't betray. Know the thing that you believe in, the thing that motivated you to do this in the first place. And if you ever start to feel that discomfort, like this is getting up against that thing that I can't let go of, that thing that I won't betray, then it's time to turn away from that, right? And so to me, that has ultimately got to be the center of how you make decisions and how you think about what you want to do. I'll give you an example. I forget the year. I'm no longer a young leader. I'm a middle-aged leader. There was a controversy in the United States because some people were considering building a mosque in Lower Manhattan. And it was close to where the World Trade Center had been. And this became a huge issue on the right. They started calling it the Ground Zero Mosque. The Ground Zero is the site where the World Trade Center was, which it wasn't really. And they used it in the worst kind of Islamophobia to say, these guys, are going to build this to show that they're bringing Sharia law to the United States, all the ugliness we've seen in American politics. You can imagine what this dialogue and debate was about. And the media love this because they love these kind of fake controversies, but they're very polarized. And all of Barack Obama's political advisors were like, whatever you do, don't talk about this, because you can only lose. If you come out for this, it's a trap that they're setting for you, President Obama. If you come out and you talk about this, then they're just going to all attack you. And so we were pretty quiet about it out of the White House for a few days, and a bunch of us were pretty uncomfortable because it was kind of ugly. And I remember he called me into his office about 2 hours before he was already scheduled to speak at the annual White House iftar dinner. And it was just me. And he said, I have these remarks. Here's what I want to say about the mosque in Lower Manhattan. And I said, well, no, everybody decided you're not supposed to talk about that. And he goes, no, I'm going to talk about it. And he basically dictated to me what he wanted to say, which is that in a nation that respects freedom of religion, we don't dictate where people can build houses of worship, whether they're churches or mosques or synagogues. You can imagine what it was. It was what Barack Obama believed. And I said, do you want me to tell everybody else about this? And he said, no, don't do that. I got an earful from some of those people after this. And I was walking out, and we get to the doorway of the Oval Office, and he says to me, sometimes you just have to say what you think. And I can't stand up in front of a room full of Muslim Americans who we're trying to welcome to demonstrate our commitment to pluralism and diversity and religious tolerance, and not address the biggest issue in the country that is being used to stigmatize them. And that, to me, was ethical leadership. That was him saying, yeah, the political thing to do would be to duck it. And sometimes people ask me, well, there's this been backlash, and didn't this backlash lead to the politics? Barack Obama won twice because he didn't hide from this. Even people who disagreed with him knew that he'd tell them what they thought, and they respected that. And so I think there's a mistake that people think that, well, if I compromise and compromise and compromise, maybe I'll make more people like you. Well, you'll compromise and compromise and compromise, and people will see that you're that kind of leader. So part of being an ethical leader, right, is showing people that there's some things you won't compromise, showing people that you'll take an unpopular position. They'll respect you more if you take an unpopular position than if you duck it.
Fred, Ben said, know what are the things that you're not willing to compromise on. You've built your career around leadership and youth development, and the vision statement, mission statement says you want to develop ethical entrepreneurial leaders for Africa. If you give people the agency to choose what they are willing to compromise or not compromise on, is there a danger there? Are there some non-negotiables? And what is the theory of change that you believe in developing ethical entrepreneurial leaders? And what's the threshold that everybody needs to clear?
Certainly. So for me, I think the ethical leadership is leadership that you'll never be ashamed of. And so I liken it to almost like if you're in a relationship with someone, are you willing to give them your cell phone to look at any time?
Can I offer your cell phone to Amanda right now?
Yeah. And know that you are absolutely comfortable with them looking through everything, and you know you haven't done anything that you'd be ashamed of. Right? So how many in this room are willing to do that with your partner? And that's great. But it's the same thing as what would you do if no one else was watching? And as a leader, now of course we're not perfect, right? But that for me is the mindset to say, I'm an open book. What we're doing is clean, it's open, and anyone can see it. Transparency, I think, really drives ethical leadership. So, in my mind, when I look at the way in which we're aiming to develop leaders, we have a model that, firstly, we don't believe that leadership is something that can be taught. we think it's possible for people to learn leadership, but you cannot teach someone leadership. This really is similar to how they say you can take a horse to the water, but you can't force the horse to drink. So this is really about people grabbing this opportunity to lead themselves. But there are three things that we do to try to enhance the likelihood of leadership happening. And the first is we bring people who have leadership potential together, and then we give them practice, because we believe the best way to learn leadership is by leading. So give people real experiences of having to make decisions and practice working with teams and so forth. And then finally, we give people networks. Because no matter how good your skills are as a leader, if you don't have access to the right partners, mentors, people who can invest in you, you won't be able to scale yourself. So if you look at the potential part, in terms of how we select leaders, I believe that there are 5 traits that leaders need to have. The first is they must have imagination. They must be able to imagine a better way of doing things, a better future, and to be able to inspire others to get there. Second is they must have passion, something that really drives them, that lights the fire in their belly, that keeps them going through all the ups and downs. Third is they must have values, and the ability to tell right from wrong, and a moral compass that enables them to make decisions, judgment. Number 4, they must have courage, because change is difficult, it's hard. That's why one of the things we say in the AL group is do hard things, right? And then finally, you must have resilience to keep going when you have all the ups and downs. So of all those 5 traits, I think you can probably compromise on 4 of them, but you can't compromise on the values part. And that, for me, is the part where if you want to truly be an ethical leader, that must be the thing that you won't compromise. Yes, maybe there'll be some days where you might not have the resilience you need. You might give up too soon. You might be a little bit less passionate someday. Maybe a little bit less courageous someday. But where you really start to go wrong as a leader, I believe, is when you start to compromise on your values.
And by values, would you put integrity at the topmost
No,
of that
absolutely.
list?
Yeah, integrity is probably the most important value, but humility, compassion, excellence, these are the kinds of things that you use. But yes, integrity, I would say, is probably the single most important value to aspire to and to uphold if you want to be an ethical leader.
Those of you who were struggling with the ethical dilemma the other day, I hope you have a bit more insights on it. Ben, I just want to quickly touch on this one. You've been involved in the setup of YALI and the Obama Leaders Program as well. What is the theory of change here? Is it what Fred is talking about? Is it about just getting young people to associate themselves with probably the most powerful brand in the world, and use that to grow themselves and their ventures? Or is there something else that you're expecting here, or that you want from them?
Well, I'd say a couple of things to start here. And first of all, I start from the belief that young people are a country's greatest asset. And, that sounds like a platitude, but let me tell you how real I think that is. Right now, old people are screwing up a lot of things. I won't talk about the United States because we're not supposed to be too political here, but that's kind of obvious. Take Brexit, right? Old people voted for Brexit in the UK, and now young people are going to have to pay the price for that for the rest of their lives. In a lot of places, what you see is that the issues that matter, climate change, how migration is managed, whether there's inclusive growth, whether technology is harnessed for good, entrepreneurship that can create broad-based growth, these are things that rely on young people. If nations and businesses and every sector represents the interests that young people have, there will be better outcomes in all of these places. And so if you look at Africa, the fact that you have such an enormous youth population, the fact that the average age in this continent is around 20 years old, that is a huge opportunity. Because frankly, if if the outcomes in countries reflect the interests of young people, I think those outcomes will be better. Because old people are probably usually trying to hang on to what they've got. Young people are usually trying to create something new, right? And so my theory of change, which I'll elaborate on a bit, but it starts with the premise that you should be looking to build something and not just hold on to what you have, right? I remember I was recently at a conference in Europe, and they were sitting around talking about migration. And they were talking about the demographics of Africa. And they were afraid of it. They said, oh no, this means that more and more people are gonna come here, and it was kind of borderline offensive, right? And I was sitting there thinking, well, yes, there's a migration issue, but all these countries are getting old, and these countries are getting young. This is an advantage for Africa. It's not just some source of something to be afraid of. We shouldn't be afraid of big populations of young people. What an opportunity, right? But you have to give outlets for young people to seize control and to move things forward. And I can also tell you, because if you're in a system, if you're in a country that is not being responsive to young people, as these populations grow, that's going to be less and less sustainable. You're not going to be able to keep the lid on as the young population grows, right? So even if in some of these countries, and there are people from countries here where you have people who are trying to keep that lid on, that's not going to be sustainable as populations grow. And we see that in Sudan right now, for instance. So what does that mean for theory of change? Well, what do young people need the most? They need each other. Our theory of change is the most important thing that we can do with our brand and with our whatever resources we have is to bring people together and build a community of people who might not agree on everything, but are like-minded in the values that they share, like-minded in the fact that they'd like to move things forward, that they'd like to promote positive change, they'd like to bring change to their communities, and we want you to be able to help each other. We want you to be able to leave here and know when you have a dilemma in 6 months, or maybe you want to start a business in 12 months, or maybe you go into government service in 18 months. Well, I met someone through the Obama Foundation who's working on something similar, who had a similar experience, and I can be connected to them, and hopefully what we can do is help forge and continue those connections, not just among this cohort, but among all of the cohorts that we've had in Africa and hopefully around the world. Because essentially, if people who are trying to promote positive change are connected to one another, if they feel like they have allies, if they feel like they have resources, if they feel like they have people who've done something that they want to do and they can reach out to and be connected to that person, you are going to build the wave that is going to bring positive change. We also have the belief deeply that you can't just have people in a silo here. The way the world works today, you can't just have the government people here and then the private sector people here and then the civil society people here. Bernadette talked about this a little bit the other night. The only way that you're going to solve the problems that we face is if everybody's getting in the room together. And so that you're meeting people from a different sector, just as you're meeting people from a different country, right? And so, again, our theory of change is change starts with young people, the impatience that young people have, the interests that young people have, the outcomes we need in the world need to reflect them, and that the way in which they can best make that change is if they have access to one another. And yes, of course, if we can open doors to other things and we can provide some inspiration and some speakers and some skills and some workshops, that's important. But I think the most important thing is that you're connected to one another. And the most important thing as you leave here, you might be thinking, well, we're leaving this place, we're having some fun here, now I have to go back home. We're in this great institution that Fred built, and it's sad to leave. But the most important thing you're going to take home with you is the relationships that you have, and that you know one another, and that you should be able to rely on and count on one another when you're in difficult spots, or when you have decisions to make, or when you want to advance opportunity in the future, because young people are each other's greatest resource.
Thank you. I'm looking at the clock, and I also want to get a sense of the audience. How many people have questions that they want to ask? I want to get a sense. Okay, we've got a few. All right, so I'll wrap up, and I'm going to do this thing that I call the quick fire round. Yeah, I'm going to ask you a few questions, and it's either a 1 or 2 word kind of question. Yeah, I'm going to start with you, Ben, before I hand over to the audience. Given your extensive diplomatic experience in Cuba, choose Cuban rum or Cuban cigar?
Rum. No, not even close. And by the way, Cuban rum is better than any other rum.
And Ben, run for office someday in the USA or work indefinitely with foundations similar to the Obama Foundation?
I don't know, and that's part of, you have to keep your options open.
Fred, Ghanaian jollof or Nigerian jollof?
Is that even a question? Ghanaian, of course. Ghanaian.
All right, Fred, still you. Minister of Education of the hypothetical USA, United States of Africa, someday, or a successful entrepreneur a la Jeff Bezos for Africa?
A successful entrepreneur who produces the Minister of Education.
Ben, 3 of the most pressing issues in Africa are?
I'd say governance, and related to that, I'd say transparency, security. But, those are obvious ones. I'd say women. If societies reflect and empower women, the outcomes are just much better. We live in a world, not just in Africa, and frankly, it's much more pronounced, or it's just as pronounced everywhere else. It's not just common in Africa. Men are really screwing things up in a lot of different places right now. I think most of the problems you see in the world are because you get a bunch of insecure men who are having trouble managing their insecurity. If we have more women in positions of responsibility, again, not just in Africa, but everywhere, I think you're going to see better outcomes in politics, in business, in society generally.
Mm-hmm. Fred, 3 massive low-hanging opportunities in Africa.
Agriculture, tourism, and the arts.
And Ben, you brought this issue a few times. I want to ask you, on this issue of gender inequality and the gap in female leadership in Africa, one thing that every woman in this room should do when they walk out of here is? Woman.
Whatever they want, because they shouldn't be told what to do by a man.
I think he can drop the mic now, right? Fred, on the issue of gender inequality and the gap in female leadership in Africa, one thing every man in this room should do once they leave this room is?
Get out of the way to allow women to step up.
Gentlemen, thank you. I'm going to turn over to the audience. I want to mention first, I have relationships and friendships to protect from the audience, so I will not choose who gets to ask a question. Fred will choose first, and then Ben will choose. Fred, you will choose 3 people. We'll take 3 questions. We'll bundle them up. The 2 of you will decide who will answer which one. What I will do, though, if I hear you say, I have a question, but it's got 4 parts, A, B, C, and D, I'll say no. Or if I hear you say, I have 2 comments, 1 question, and 1 whatever, that will be an absolute no, all right? So Fred, you get to choose 3 hands and 3 questions. All right, please stand up. The gentleman at the back, all right? 1, 2, and then? All right, 3. Your 3 questions. Please be concise and precise. Thank you.
Daniela Rakut-Mamounds from Madagascar. Thank you, Fred. I have a question for you. I am a solo entrepreneur, and I have 5 companies spread in 4 different locations, and I have absolutely no office in any of these 4 locations. So I'm really happy that it's the first time that I see a leader that have the same way of functioning than me. I don't have an office. I just work with everybody in open space, and during the lunchtime, I just share the lunch with all of my employees. But the problem is this. In our community in Madagascar, a real leader don't stay with everybody like this. He has to keep himself in another way. If not, he's not a good leader. So it becomes a kind of advocacy to, bring humility in the world of leadership. And so people don't always accept that, mainly the older generation. And most of my managers are older people, so they tell it's not normal.
Sorry, the question.
What's your opinion?
I'm going to paraphrase. The question is, you're asking Fred if you need to change that culture because older generations don't buy into it. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, and I would like to have his opinion on
Okay.
this change, which is really new for us.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Go
Yes, sir.
first. Go first. Yeah, go first.
Well, she doesn't have a microphone, so you go first.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you very much. My question is for Fred. I was glad when you said you've been to the Gambia. I'm Fatmata Kasama from the Gambia. We had a dictator leader for over 22 years. So now we have a president, and then as citizens, we are not satisfied with it. So my question is, does LA have any programs in place that can bring leaders in our society that became presidents or ministers by chance or opportunities to train them on ethical leadership? Thank you.
Hello, Omar from Comoros. So my question, I have an organization work with NGO and entrepreneur to build sustainable business and project in different community. So I have some question, 2 or 1.
No.
Okay, one question. So today, if we ask each of us what the big issue we have to bring our business or our NGO, it's money. So I really believe that it's not. But I want to have your view about this thing. And if that's money, what's your recommendation for all of these entrepreneurs here to building business without money?
Cool. So 2 to you. Ben, you want to take the last one? Yeah, thanks. All right, Fred, you go.
So I think just quickly comment on I guess your comment about, what real leaders do, being separated from their people. I don't think those are real leaders. So I think for me, it's very simple. I mean, you shouldn't be defined by what you expect society, what society expects of you. So if in Madagascar, people think that you have to be a big man or a big woman and therefore not engage with people, I don't think that that's being a real leader. I think a real leader, goes out, talks to people that they're supposed to serve. They realize that their job is not to be famous and powerful, but to serve others. And that's what being real leadership is, in my mind. And then to your question about the Gambia, yes, I enjoyed living there as, from the age of 4 to 8. We used to eat Benachin. I used to speak Wolof. You raised a good question about, does ALA have programs for leaders who find themselves in power by accident? I actually think it's actually a good point you make. You see, because societies that do not effectively groom their leaders get the leaders they deserve, because you then end up with a lot of people who suddenly end up in positions of power and they haven't been prepared. We train our doctors, we train our lawyers, we train our engineers. Why we're not training leaders? And that was exactly the reason why we started the African Leadership Academy and now the university and the business school and so forth. So a lot of the work we are doing increasingly is actually working with senior leaders. We are working with leaders in corporate world. We are soon looking to do work with leaders in government as well. Because we believe that you never quite arrive at your destination as a leader. And the problems in Africa are so urgent that we cannot wait 30 years until the leaders we're developing at ALA or ALU who are young, until they rise and become influential. So we need to start working with leaders who are already in power today, and we are starting to do more of that.
Cool.
So on money, and let me just say at the outset that obviously this is going to be different in different countries, in different environments, right? Just on entrepreneurship, some countries have a more developed ecosystem where people can get capital, others don't. So I'm going to necessarily generalize a bit here. And some of you have organizations that need funding, some of you have businesses and ideas that need funding. What I try to say that there are in common, and I work with a lot of small NGOs, and I know a lot of entrepreneurs, so informed by that experience. And I'm part of, I sit on the board of of a couple of grant-giving organizations myself. I'd say number one, you have to, and I said this in my workshop earlier, but number one, you have to think about why your organization or your idea is different from anybody else's, right? What is it that is unique and distinctive about what you are trying to get funding for? Because if you're an entrepreneur and you're looking for capital, a lot of people are getting pitched a lot of different things. If you're an organization that is trying to solve a problem, there are probably a lot of different organizations trying to solve that one problem. You have to know in your mind, what is the thing about what I'm doing that is distinct, that should get attention from people, right? And that is going to differentiate me from others. That's the first thing. The second thing I think you need to do is never put all of your, to use an American expression, eggs in one basket. Don't just have one source that you're looking for. Try to map out, where's all the different places that I can try to get funding for what I'm doing, right? What are all the different organizations? Where is capital reaching other entrepreneurs, or where are grants coming to other organizations? Cast a very wide net, because sometimes what people, they find the best person or organization that they want to get funding from, and they spend all their time and put all of their energy into just this one pitch. I think you have to cast your net much more widely. And then third, if you have that thing that that is distinct about what you're doing, and you have different sources that you're looking for, then you have to think about, how do I get this? How do I communicate this? How do I put this together in a pitch? Or if I'm an organization, it's not just about going to get a grant. How do I get potentially some positive media attention or validation for what I'm doing, so that when I'm putting this forward, it's not just me who's vouching for myself, it's others. What is the story that you are trying to tell about what you are doing? And you have to do that if you're an entrepreneur or if you're in civil society. And how can I get that story out, not just to the person I'm asking for money, but to others who could be sources of validation for what I'm doing? And frankly, the Obama Foundation can be one of those sources as well.
And if I could just add on to this, I agree with everything that Ben has said. I completely agree that you got to distinguish yourself and look various places, and also make sure you've got a good story to tell. I would add on something that has been my experience from the African perspective of raising money. Collectively in the AL group over the last 15 years, we've raised $200 million US. So that's a lot of money. I can share, my experience has been that actually money is normally not the problem that is preventing entrepreneurs in Africa from being successful. It's often used as an excuse. In my opinion, for a venture to take off, there's three things that need to come together. First is you need an idea of a product or service you're going to deliver. The second is you need a team that can execute and get things done. The third is you need the money, the capital. When you're in the West, the mix of those three things is there's plenty of capital, right? Lots of billions of dollars looking for ideas. Really, really great teams, excellent education, people with great experience. But what's scarce are the ideas, because everything has already been done in the rest of the world. When you come to Africa, the mix of those three things, ideas are plenty. Everywhere you look, you pick up a stone, there's another idea, right? There's so much that has not been done. So the ideas are plenty. You don't have to even be super innovative. You just look around. Oh, there's no hospitals. Maybe I should build hospitals. There's no credit cards. Oh, maybe I should create consumer credit. There's no pharmacies. Maybe I should build a pharmacy. We can come up with 100 ideas. The capital is actually increasingly available because, in the West, they're getting old and they need to find places to invest their money. So there's billions of dollars looking for great investments. What is scarce are teams that can execute and teams that can get things done and that don't just talk and that have a reputation and that can be trusted. So you need to distinguish yourself as one of those individuals or teams, as people who can actually get things done. You don't just talk. When you do that, you'll find all the money you need.
Thank you, Fred. All right, Ben, your turn to pick 3 hands, and we'll bundle them up, and then we will answer the questions.
One right there.
Who's that? All right, yep.
There's one waving here. Yeah.
All right.
And then down here.
Okay, the 3 individuals, yep? Yes. All right, we'll start over there. The first question, shoot.
My name is Suleiman. I'm from Tanzania, the land of Zanzibar and Kilimanjaro. I have a question for you, Ben. You have talked about challenges facing Africa, governance, security, and the issues of women. If you could given an opportunity to work as advisor towards formulation of one united Africa, what would you say? Is it the right time for Africa to unite from your leadership perspective and the diplomatic experiences that you have?
To unite across Africa.
Yes, across Africa.
Yeah.
Looking at all the challenges that we have.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. I'm Daviera Tukba Cassell, and I'm from Liberia. My question is to you, Ben. I want you to please tell us your most difficult or challenging moment during your service of the Obama tenure, and what were the ethical values that you used to overcome those challenges?
Who is that lady over here? Yep, right here.
Okay, thank you. I really love the concept of ethical leadership, and it was very insightful in any other ways, and I've never heard of the word ethical leadership before. But my question is regarding most ethics, when you think about ethics and values, they're like brought with us. The society determines our ethical values. So can we teach a person ethical value, especially even if at the young age like us, like our core values or maybe our like ethics, the bad and the goods are already created by our society and in our family. So can we really teach someone to be ethical? Can we do that, really?
Cool.
That's
Fred, you'll take that one. All right, Ben, you've got 2 questions, yeah? Your opinion on uniting the continent as one, most difficult challenge, moment serving under President Barack Obama.
So on the first question, one of the things, there's a few elements of this, so I'll try to not go on too long. One of the things I noticed that was interesting when, for instance, we would be negotiating agreements with African countries, trade agreements, trade and commercial agreements, migration agreements, is I started to look at how everything was set up, the infrastructure of global trade, global movement of peoples. And I remember talking to the people, just to take trade as an example. How come it's easier for some of these countries to trade with us than it is for them to trade with other African countries that are right around them? Or how come we have visa policies that, I didn't understand why people didn't see that there was more opportunity for Africa to start to break down barriers of the movement of peoples within Africa, the movement of capital within Africa, the ease of trade within Africa, to harmonize the kind of rules and regulations that govern the flow of people and capital and goods across Africa. That is a huge impediment and potentially can be turned into a huge advantage, right? So to me, I'd be thinking about how to, people focus on the politics of this, the politics of union. It's actually not a bad model, what the Europeans did. They started with a customs union, right? They started with, how do you break down barriers to trade? And how do you break down barriers to how people move around? And it took, decades for that to lead to political union. But I think it would really unleash, and Fred and I were actually just talking about this, the potential for Africa. If suddenly, you had the ability for there to be industry that cross borders more, and services that cross borders more, and that workforces could cross borders more. So that's the first point I make. I think the second point I make, and this is a tricky one and a difficult one, but there are, I think, some common challenges, even though places are distinct. You have to try to find, you have to have the humility, frankly, in some places to figure out, well, who's doing this best, and how can I replicate that, and then how can we build that out across the continent? One of the things that I've found that's quite interesting in Africa, right, is that different people solving different problems in different places. Like, there's extraordinary things being done with mobile money in some places. There's actually some interesting things being done with kind of mobile justice in other places. There's interesting things being done on transparency and anti-corruption in some places. How do you take the countries or regions that are setting the, blazing the trail, and then try to make that the norm, try to raise the standards across the region to that level, right? And so, the breaking down the barriers, but also breaking down the barriers to aspire to the places that are doing things the best, right? And having the humility of figuring out, well, these people had a really good idea, and let's try to replicate that. So that, again, everybody wants to jump to the aspiration of political union, but part of this is just how do we make things work better, and how do we find the best ideas and replicate them, and how do we tear down the barriers to those ideas. Obviously, then you have huge security challenges, and one of the things that I think would be enormously useful is, to really build out the capacity of regional organizations, the African Union, but also some of the other regional organizations, to solve problems. I think rightly people sometimes say to the United States, well, you guys don't really understand what's happening here. Well, yeah, you guys understand better. And so the United States would come and support you, but I'd like to see Africans regionally take increasing responsibility for dealing with security and political challenges in their own neighborhood. And to think, and this is happening, I don't want to suggest it's not, but if something is happening if I'm in ECOWAS and something is happening in this area, like, that matters to me, and I want to be part of the solution here. And so I think another step towards political union is some of the regional subgroups beginning to get better at solving their political and security problems, right? Because all of these are stepping stones to the potential of a united Africa, right? Demonstrate that you can tear down barriers to what matters in people's pockets, which is trade, commerce, and movement of peoples and capital. Demonstrate that you're going to take the gold standard and aspire to that and try to replicate success stories across the continent. And then demonstrate that you can solve for some of these really difficult political and security challenges in your regional subgroups and ultimately potentially continent-wide, right? And that's going to take serious reform. These places can't just be talk shops, You don't want just people going to the African Union to deliver a bunch of speeches and then come home. Or, these places have to matter. These institutions have to matter. And they have to, be closer to the concerns of people and to concerns not just of governments, but civil society. But I think there's extraordinary potential if Africa can move in this direction. You have collectively just a tremendous amount of resources. The problem is they're not being harnessed collectively, They're being, stuck in different silos or different regions or different countries. And you have to think about, what do we have as a continent, and how do we create political and economic arrangements that allow us to take advantage of that? In a weird way, it may relate to the other question, which is, for me, the most difficult meetings I had tended, in the most difficult moments I had in the Obama years, usually related to Syria. I had to walk into Barack Obama's office on Air Force One with Malia sitting there and ask her to leave so that I could tell him that the first American had been beheaded by ISIS. Or I had groups of Syrians confront me in various places, outraged that the United States was not intervening in Syria militarily to get rid of Assad. I had many moments that reflected the difficulty of that situation and our seeming inability to solve it. And that connects to a broader lesson, though, that I had to learn. And I'm not saying this to justify our Syria policy or the things that we didn't do in Syria. It will sound like it, but part of leadership that I had to wrestle with is, you have to know what you're unable to solve. The United States had the experience of the Afghan war, of the Iraq war, then Libya. It might turn out that the American military can't fix places, and when we go into places, a lot of times we make them worse. There's some places in Africa that I wonder whether America is making it better or worse. We can do certain things very well. We can take out things. Militaries are built to destroy things. They're not built to build them back up. And so for me, that was painful to recognize, though, because you see something and you want to do something about it, and you want to be active. And so I'm drawing a pretty big leap here, but I think what I had to learn as a lesson about how hard it is to be in a situation where you want to help people, but you also have to confront the reality that if we go into yet another war, maybe we'll make it worse. And can we go into a war in like the 7th country that we've gone to a war in 10 years? When is this going to stop? But it also had to make me think about things of, well, you have to pick your spots as a leader as to where you can make a difference. And in the second term of the Obama administration, as I got more and more skeptical about military power, I started to look around, well, where are the opportunities? A diplomatic opportunity with Cuba, or working on issues related to climate change and the Paris Accords, or working on programs like YALI, right? A leader has to be able to distinguish between and acknowledge, here's what I can't do, and then here's what I can do, right? And that was like the hardest thing for me to deal with, because it involved confronting some incredibly difficult situations that I frankly came to believe, not that I was in any way the president, but that we just couldn't solve. And that led to the most difficult moments that I mentioned, but it also led to a very difficult realization. There was a very painful realization in some ways that what I was confronting was the limits of what America could do, right? And then how do I have to respond to that? Well, you don't just completely give up. You try to find, well, where can we make a difference? And on whether that's on Syria, what we could try to do on a humanitarian or refugee basis, or whether that's on other issues around the world.
Thanks for sharing that, Ben. Fred.
Yeah, there's a question about is it possible to, teach someone ethics, especially as they grow, because that's something that's typically developed in children by their parents. I really believe that, again, like going back to the point I made earlier about that you cannot teach leadership, but you can create an environment where people can learn leadership. I believe the same with ethics. One of the most inspiring things about human beings is our ability to learn by ourselves. We are lifelong learners. We never stop learning. And, we begin learning at the age of maybe 3 months for 6 months. If you think about it, there's no curriculum that teaches a child language. There's no curriculum that teaches them how to walk. They learn by themselves. And so a lot of research shows that any skill that is developed, only 10% of that is developed in the classroom by someone teaching it to you. 20% comes from what you learn from what they call developmental relationships from your mentors and your peers and people that you surround yourself with. And 70% comes from experience. You learn best through doing. And so I believe that if you create an environment where people are being exposed to great peers and mentors who challenge them and role models, and they are, more importantly, doing things where their ethical muscles are being tested, because ethics is like a muscle. You build it over time by experience and seeing what's rewarded and what you're held accountable to, and so forth. People can change. And we've seen it over and over and again when people come here from all around the world, all around Africa, and they've got certain views and certain ethics, and they are exposed to different ways of doing things, and they're tested and challenged by their peers and by the people who are holding them accountable, and what's rewarded and what's celebrated. And you start to see them changing their view of the world. And within a year, 2, 3 years, they are different people. It obviously helps if you're a bit younger, because then you're less set in your ways. But we find time and time again that people can change. They can learn different ways of doing things.
Thank you. We have unfortunately run out of time. We'll have to bring this to a close. Because you need to have dinner, right? And the closing ceremony. It's not my... No? You want to stick around and do another round of questions? You guys up for 2 more questions? But very short questions, but it will take only 2. Fred will choose 1, Ben will choose 1, and they will give you brief answers and we'll close up. They're standing even.
I'll choose that guy at the back there.
That gentleman at the back over there. Ben, you want to choose 1 person? All right, quickly, please keep it brief so we can get a brief answer. We already have 2. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Please sit down. Yes, Gabriel.
Fred, Ben, thank you very much. My name is Gabriel, technically from South Africa, but fundamentally from Africa. I would love to connect with your humanity and find out if there was a profound moment in your life that affirmed your oneness and that continues to inspire the work that you do to bring African leaders together. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to try to paraphrase that. So you've asked them to tap into their humanity and tell you a moment in their life that led them to the realization that they want to work with young African talent. Something along those lines. Thank you, Gabe. You know you're a very difficult philosopher to summarize, right? Yes, sir.
Okay, so my name is Kemo from Senegal. I would like to ask a question to Ben. I know that we receive donation link to the Obama Foundation. Most of us here can donate $20, $100. But what can we do more as someone who has benefited from the program to the Obama Foundation?
All right. Shall we start with that, Ben? What can they do more for the foundation? And then Fred.
We don't need any money from, what we want is your engagement, and there are 2 things that I would say, right? The theory of change depends upon, and this is what ALA does in a way, multiplying the effect of what you're doing to others, right? So just as I mentioned that you can all be a source of support to each other, number 1, what we want to build, and the way in which you build to scale and ways to create change, are if the cohorts that come through here each year stay a part of one network. I mean, think about it. We had 200 people here last year. We had 200 people here this year. 200 is great. But as Fred said, this is a long-term process. If 5, 10 years from now, that's suddenly in the thousands. We want you to stay engaged and to help the people that are coming behind you in these programs and to stay engaged as a part of this network, right? We also think about taking the skills or whatever you've learned here and will continue to learn over the course of the year, and how can you look for opportunities to transmit that to other people in your own communities. And the point here is not, again, that this is some form of giving or charity. I think the point is that there's a profound self-interest that people have in there being like-minded people who are seeking to pursue the type of change that has been discussed here the last 5 days. The more people there are like you in more places, the better it's going to be for you, right? So the idea of staying engaged with this network, the idea of making sure that you could be a potential mentor to people who are coming from behind you, the idea that you could take the types of things you've learned here and bring them back to your organization or your community or your government, that is the theory of change that it's the same thing the ALA is doing, that the more that these skills and this brand of ethical leadership and these values and all the things that we've talked about here today, the more that is spread, the better environment you're going to have for the work that you're doing. And so what we really want you is to just stay engaged. Stay engaged with us, stay engaged with each other, stay engaged with the people coming behind you, and think about how can you take whatever you've learned here and will continue to learn in your engagement with us and reach other people in your own communities.
Thank you. Fred, what was that moment that made you realize you wanted to be at the service of youth?
Well, I wouldn't say that there was one specific moment, but it's probably an accumulation of many, many defining moments throughout my life that I probably only realized maybe 5 years ago that this was my purpose, to really help to develop youth in Africa. And I really believe that, as I mentioned, we've all been put on earth for a purpose, and we go through life, and certain things happen by accident or by design that gives you a signal. And you only really realize it periodically when you look back on your life and you see all these patterns. And so, for example, I'll just tell you one example of one of those moments. When I was 16, my dad passed away, and we were living in Botswana at that time. And my mother had a good track record as a teacher in the town we lived in, Selebipikwe. So many of the... you're from Selebipikwe? Okay. And the parents approached her and they said, "We really like you to start a school to teach, our kids, because you seem to know what you're doing." And she said, "Well, I can't quit my job as a teacher. I've got 4 kids to look after. They have to go to college, and she can't do it." But they kept insisting, so she decided that she would start a small study group with 5 children in a small church building and 1 teacher. And then next year, more parents brought their kids, and I'd grown to about 25 children. And by this time, I had finished my high school and I had 1 year to go to college. I had to take a gap year. And my mother said, "Okay, you're going to be the headmaster of the school." Because she had a full-time job as a teacher. So she made me run the school at the age of 18, 25 kids. I taught the classes. I managed the engagement with the parents and so forth. But during that 1 year, it was remarkable to me seeing the impact that we had on people who came in and they, couldn't speak English, didn't have much skills, and by the end of the year, they had been transformed. And that was one of those defining moments, and I've had several others that cumulatively realized that I've had some unique experiences that have prepared me better than most people in the world to do this job. And so that's, again, what I realized, that I was being prepared, whether by accident or by chance, for this, and I feel blessed to be able to do this work today.
I guess the one thing I'd say is I had a number of experiences in my time in government where I met with people and they were assuming extraordinary risks. I met with people who knew that because they were coming to a meeting with the US government, they could be put in prison. And some of them were. And I won't name the countries, but you probably know which ones they are. I met with people who could have left their countries and chose to stay. And I'd say, you get asylum. This is the last administration. And they'd say, no, this is my home, and I'm gonna stay. And some of those people were imprisoned, or their spouses were imprisoned. And how can I look at that kind of courage and not think that, sure, I was on, Fred and I have been on these lists that have been cited, 40 under 40, but I'm telling you guys, there's millions of people around the world who are just as talented as me. I happen to be born in a certain place. I happen to have certain opportunities. So did Fred here on this continent. But to me, it's not just Africa. To me, this is everywhere. And frankly, it's in the United States now too. But if there are people, always remember, there are people out there who have it harder than you, as hard as you have it. And always in your toughest moment, think about the people who have it tougher. And think about the only thing that is going to change that is if people stick together. And I mentioned this the other day. There are more of us than them. And so to me, and this is why, to end on the foundation note, Barack Obama, he said to us, I don't want to cure a disease or, just fight climate change or advocate for human rights or, start businesses. I want to help all the people who are going to do those things. When you get angry and you get frustrated, the thing that is going to make a difference is people. And to me, the motivating moments for me were moments when I met people who were putting a lot more on the line than I was. If they can put that on the line, then I have to do my part, and we all have to do our part. And that, that's going to guide me for the rest of the work that I do.
Ben, I'll say thank you, and I know I speak on behalf of everyone when I say it's been so great to have you with us over the last few days. You've been such a great source of wisdom. You're kind of like Yoda hanging out in the corner. Leader you shall become, but humble you should remain. But we're really, really appreciative of you being here with us and just sharing all these stories and truly inspiring. Thank you very much. Fred, thank you for being an inspiring big brother to all these young leaders right here. To see what you've done on the continent is inspirational, and I'm sure a lot of us are motivated to do a lot more. Please put your hands together one more time for our panelists. Thank you guys for being a great audience, and those watching us out there, bye-bye. Thank you very much. Have a good night.